It is clearly now the will of the Parliamentary Conservative Party that there should be a new leader of that party and therefore a new Prime Minister. I've tried to persuade my colleagues that it would be eccentric to change governments when we're delivering so much and when we have such a vast mandate and when we're actually only a handful of points behind in the polls, even in mid-term after quite a few months of pretty relentless sledging, and when the economic scene is so difficult domestically and internationally. And I regret not to have been successful in those arguments, but as we've seen at Westminster, the herd instinct is powerful, and when the herd moves, it moves. And my friends, in politics, no one is remotely indispensable.
Hello, I'm Peter York, author, journalist, occasional televisionist, and president of the Media Society. This afternoon's event is the launch of this timely and excellent book, Boris Johnson, Media Creation, Cloud, Casualty. 30 essays, all about Mr. Johnson, as I call him. Less than a tenner on Amazon. There are some very familiar names you'll recognise amongst the writers. There's Gina Miller, Sir John Curtis, Ray Snoddy, for example, and of course, me. Now, Mr. Johnson's never really had a proper job. His job has always been performing the Boris character. He's a failed PM now, but also, you might argue, a failed comic. A man who's invented and reinvented himself.
The life and lies of Boris Johnson, from the day he was born to the day he became Prime Minister. June 1964. Alexander Boris de Pfeffel Johnson is born in New York. His earliest recorded ambition is to become World King. 1982. In a letter to Johnson's father, an Eton schoolteacher writes of the 17-year-old Boris Johnson,
"He sometimes seems affronted when criticised for what amounts to a gross failure of responsibility, and surprised at the same time that he was not appointed captain of the school for the next half. I think he honestly believes that it is churlish of us not to regard him as an exception, one who should be free of the network of obligation that binds everyone else."
1983. Johnson becomes a leading member of Oxford University's male-only Bullingdon Club. During his tenure, the club's members indulge in sexist taunting, vandalism, restaurant trashing, bullying and ritual humiliation of the poor. One recruiter for the club will later describe it during Johnson's time, saying Bullingdon members
found it amusing if people were intimidated or frightened by their behaviour. I remember them walking down a street in Oxford in their tails, chanting "Buller, Buller," and smashing bottles along the way just to cow people. Boris was one of the big beasts of the club. He was up for anything. They treated certain types of people with absolute disdain and referred to them as plebs.
1984. Sixth former Damien Furness visits Johnson's Oxford College for his entrance interview. Many years later, he will relate what happened.
I was staying the night and had an evening to kill in the college bar. Johnson was propping it up with his coterie of acolytes, whose only apparent role in life was to laugh at his jokes. In the course of my pint, I felt obliged to finish. He mocked my speech impediment, my accent, my school, my dress sense, my haircut, my background, my father's work as a farm worker and garage proprietor, and my prospects in the scholarship interview I was there for. His only motivation was to amuse his posh boy mates.
1987. At the age of 23, Johnson marries the daughter of a millionaire art historian. Fresh out of university and aided by family connections, he lands a traineeship at the Times newspaper. 1988. Johnson is sacked as a trainee at the Times for making up a quote on his first front-page story. 1990. Johnson conspires with his Bullingdon Club friend Darius Guppy to have a fellow journalist assaulted. The two discuss in detail how badly assaulted the man will be, including cracked ribs and black eyes, before Johnson agrees to supply the journalist's address for the attack to be carried out.
Boris, have you got this number? How badly are you going to hurt this guy? Okay, let me explain this. You will not be put into intensive care or anything like that. Okay, Derry, I said I'll do it. Don't worry.
The conspiracy goes nowhere, and no attack happens. 1994. He is now a columnist for The Telegraph and The Spectator magazine. His columns include racially charged invectives such as slamming Nelson Mandela for the, quote, tyranny of black majority rule in post-apartheid South Africa, and describing Chinese workers as, quote, puffing coolies. 1995. He describes the children of single mothers as, quote, ill-raised, ignorant, aggressive and illegitimate, saying it is, quote, outrageous that married couples should pay for the single mother's desire to procreate independently of men. In the same piece, he dismisses working class men as, quote, likely to be drunk, criminal, aimless, feckless and hopeless. 1999, Johnson is made editor of The Spectator magazine, promising owner Conrad Black he will not stand to be an MP. 2000, Johnson begins a relationship with one of his employees. He promises her that he will leave his wife to marry her. He does not leave his wife. 2003, Johnson is made vice chair of the Conservative Party and shadow arts minister. 2004, rumours circulate that Johnson has got one of his employees pregnant, resulting in her having an abortion. Johnson slams the suggestion as, quote, complete balderdash and an inverted pyramid of piffle, and assures Conservative Party leader Michael Howard that the claim is untrue. In reality, the rumours are entirely true. Johnson is sacked from his position as Tory vice chair and shadow minister for lying to the party leader. 2005, Johnson steps down as editor of The Spectator. Advising his successor on how to deal with a senior female colleague, he says, just pat her on the bottom and send her on her way. 2014, Johnson denies at least 17 times that he will stand as an MP while still in post as Mayor of London. 2015, Johnson stands as an MP while still in post as Mayor of London. 2016, hedging his bets, Johnson drafts 2 Brexit articles, one pro-Leave and the other pro-Remain. In his pro-Remain article, Johnson says the UK should remain, quote, intimately engaged in the EU, and that Brexit could cause an economic shock, the diminishing of Britain on the world stage, and the breakup of the Union. 2 days later, Johnson announces he will be campaigning for Vote Leave. Johnson is now having an affair with Carrie Symonds, a former communications director for the Conservative Party. Johnson and his wife will soon separate. 2019, police are called to Symonds' South London flat after reports of a serious altercation. Neighbours report hearing a woman screaming, followed by slamming and banging. Symonds is reportedly heard screaming at Johnson to, quote, get off me and get out of my flat.
Self-styled Bojo is a media confection. He first came to media types' attention as a journalist for the Daily Telegraph, playing fast and loose with the truth to amuse in Brussels and London. Since then, he's been promoted and indulged by the right-wing British press right to the bitter end of his premiership and beyond. There is life after political death. Ray Snoddy, the doyen of media correspondence, reports from the crypt.
I think there were 2 main reasons. One, the right-wing press, as you will well remember, were desperate supporters of Brexit, desperate to get it done, worried that somehow Theresa May would bungle it, and were all in the plot to get rid of her and replace her with Boris, who would indeed get Brexit done, which they admire him for to this very day. And the second underlying reason, which is true to this day, is that the right-wing press, particularly the Daily Mail, remains absolutely convinced that Boris Johnson is the best Tory leader, would be the best Tory leader to defeat who they see as the rather boring Keir Starmer. I've actually had this in person from one of the top Mail hierarchy. That's why they were so reluctant to let him go. And indeed, you see occasional twitches that they're still hoping that somehow they might get him back. That Boris is the one. Boris is the one who got the 80-seat majority, and Boris, the Teflon man, could do it again for the Tories. So those are the 2 main reasons, I believe. Well, they didn't. Some of, the Mail, I don't think, has totally fallen out in love with him at all. I mean, they right to on that Thursday morning when he went out, they were still urging Boris to stand and fight to the very last moment. But I suppose they have to face reality. He is no longer leader of the Conservative Party, and as of September the 6th, he will no longer be political leader. So, Prime Minister. So they have to find the best possible replacement as far as they're concerned. And it looks like they think Liz Truss is the best. Maybe not quite Boris, but the closest thing to Boris they're likely to get. Boris, it must be remembered, has never done an honest day's work in his life outside journalism and the House of Commons and Foreign Office and things like that. So he's been a journalist throughout. He even managed to help. Obviously, we're looking back with hindsight. He even managed to help create the anti-EU mood that many decades later, which was to lead to him actually becoming Prime Minister, and when out of office on the back benches, the Daily Telegraph gave him a lucrative perch where he could hone his fine and right-wing words and become a persona in the public mind, with all of which played into and helped him getting that 80-seat majority. Though people tend to forget, it was partly down to him and his bravura, but just as much down, I think, to the fact that too many people just weren't prepared to vote for that particular version of the Labour Party. As a journalist, he makes headlines. He's huge, sort of. I mean, it seems trivial to say hugely entertaining, but he is. I mean, I keep to this day meeting intelligent women, particularly of a certain age, who say, well, I know he maybe didn't always tell the truth, but I liked Boris. So he could cut through to people. And although it has to be remembered that his former employer, Sir Max Hastings at the Daily Telegraph, said, the more you get to know Boris, the less you like him. And it's only that he can do these superficial relationships with people through the television camera and through the press, where people think he's a rather better person than he actually is. The real irony, of course, is that to the extent to which Boris was a media creation, it was ultimately the media that pulled him down. Certainly the Daily Mirror and ITV did Partygate, but ultimately the Pincher story, but more his reaction to it, of course, the Pincher story that did for him, it was actually an exclusive from The Sun, one of his most rabid supporters throughout.
It looks like from hero to zero for Mr. Johnson, from an 80-seat election victory in December 2019 to being turfed out on his ear less than 3 years later. How did this happen? The great professor of politics from Strathclyde University, Sir John Curtis, tells us why and when the British public's love affair with Boris ended. Sir John.
Well, in the end, Boris Johnson lost the electorate because a governing style that has hitherto served him relatively well came unstuck when it was discovered that he was applying that style for causes and for reasons in which very few people felt that what he was doing was justified, and where, in addition, they began to have doubts about whether or not he was telling the truth. So, what is that governing style? Well, that governing style was essentially one whereby the Prime Minister, from the outset, was pretty clearly much more interested in outcome, in achieving what he wanted to achieve as Prime Minister, and perhaps was rather less concerned about how he got there, and concerns about things like due process and following a constitutional convention. These were not things that seemingly particularly troubled the Prime Minister. And this became evident from the first major row of his premiership, which was, of course, the attempt in early September 2019 to prorogue Parliament, to stop it from meeting in the wake of an anticipated new Queen's speech, but not doing it for a few days, which was that normal convention, but trying to do so for a matter of 5 or 6 weeks. Well, that in the end went before the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said, actually, Prime Minister, you've broken the law. Parliament was not legally prorogued, and indeed, in the wake of that, the House of Commons duly came back and sat again. And this was a governing style that also worked during COVID. Sure, lots of complaints about, have PPE contracts gone to Conservative friends? Was it necessarily right to buy a lot of vaccines that we didn't know were going to work? Procurement rules were seemingly bent to a degree. But of course, in the end, we got a vaccine. We got a vaccine before everybody else. The government very, very effectively sold its management of getting the first COVID-19 vaccine out, widely regarded as one of its successes. And so therefore, again, given that everybody wanted the pandemic over as soon as quickly, his governing style worked to his advantage. It's when we get to the last 7 or 8 months of his premiership, including party gains, where Boris Johnson's governing style begins to come on unstuck. He begins actually with not with party gains, but with the Owen Paterson family. Remember, Owen Paterson, the then Conservative MP for North Shropshire, had been found by the Commons Privileges Committee to have broken the laws on paid lobbying, which essentially said if you're a paid lobbyist, you can't be off then trying to have private discussions with ministers. And Mr. Paterson, it was recommended, should be suspended for 10 days, if I remember correctly. Well, he got his MPs to vote against that suspension. Enormous row. 24 hours later, he backtracks. And meanwhile, there is quite a substantial public reaction. You're getting around 60% or so of people saying that actually, no, Mr. Paterson should have been suspended. What we have to remember here is that MPs' second jobs, like being a paid lobbyist, they're not popular with the electorate. You can be a doctor and do it and have a second job, or a nurse, or maybe even a care worker. But anybody who's basically making seemingly quite a lot of money rather than doing their job as an MP is, in the eye of many voters, not a reasonable cause. So the fact that Boris Johnson tried to overturn principal constitutional convention, the rules of the House of Commons, on this occasion, there was a public reaction. And the Conservatives, who had been still 4 points ahead in the poll before this broke out, found that their poll lead disappeared, and Mr. Johnson's personal popularity fell back as well. And then we come to Partygate. So at the beginning of December of 2021, we begin to get stories about alleged gatherings being held in and around 10 Downing Street, seemingly in contravention of the then coronavirus rules, which essentially said that, you can get together for essential work, but that's it. Any kind of socializing was outside the remit of the regulations. And then now, famously, and just demonstrating that a picture is worth 1,000 words, we had that video released of Allegra Stratton, the then Prime Minister's spokesperson, giggling nervously in referring to what in effect was a party held before the previous Christmas, and this is the Christmas of 2020, against the lockdown regulation. So that gave the story life. And the truth is, pretty rapidly, we discovered two things as the Prime Minister assured the House of Commons that no rules had been broken. One was that a majority of the public were saying, well, if the rules have been broken, the Prime Minister should resign. And secondly, around 3/4 of people, 7%, 3/4 of people say, actually, we don't think he's telling the truth. And we think that actually, maybe he should resign. So the public came to a judgment very, very quickly. And the truth is that initial impression that the Prime Minister had broken the rules, and that indeed, in addition, he was not telling the truth about what had happened, that impression, if anything, was reinforced, including nearly a half of people who voted Conservative in 2019 were saying, frankly, we don't think he's telling the truth. We think the rules were broken. And that typically, according to the polls, approaching 2/3 of people throughout this period were saying he should go. That the Prime Minister was now seemingly becoming potentially an electoral liability and not the asset he had been in 2019. And that above all, there was a question mark about whether or not he was telling the truth about an issue on which voters cared, because everybody remembered the sacrifices they made during the pandemic. Some of them, ones that gave them a lot of grief and a lot of angst, not going to people's funerals, not being able to visit loved ones in hospitals, even when they were dying. Given all of that, when along came a situation in which it seemed that actually the Prime Minister had not told the truth about what he knew when he appointed Chris Pincher as his Deputy Chief Whip, then perhaps almost inevitably there was at that stage a majority of Conservative MPs who could no longer feel that they could face the electorate on television, on radio, and defend the Prime Minister. Thus the mass resignations, and thus the downfall of Boris Johnson.
Bojo the clown will be remembered as much for his comedic as for his political skills, using language to disarm, to defend, and to distract. It worked until Partygate. Then it was just one lie too many to be investigated, even by AC-12.
AC-12 interview by Superintendent Hastings, DI Fleming, DI Arnold. On screen, item reference LBD1. LBD1 is an email sent by your principal private secretary, Martin Reynolds, inviting more than 100 Downing Street staff to attend a party on the evening of May 20th, 2020.
All that is subject for an interview, for an investigation by Sucre.
We've investigated it, and the facts are plain for everyone to see.
On May 20th, 2020, the whole country was in lockdown.
Only an hour before the party began, Oliver Dowden, your culture secretary, made a statement reminding the public of COVID regulations.
People were only permitted to meet with one person outside the household in an outdoor, public place provided that they stay 2 meters apart.
Sir, a gathering like the one described in LBD1 would have been a breach of the health protection regulations in operation at the time, as well you know.
All the evidence I can see is that people have stayed within the rules. If that turns out not to be the case, and people wish to bring allegations to my attention or to the police or whoever, then of course there will be a proper sanction.
I can assure you, people have brought it to the attention of the police. Sir, did you breach said health protection regulations?
All of that, as you know, is the subject of a proper investigation by Sucre.
During lockdown, people had to cancel their weddings.
They were kept from visiting sick relatives.
People couldn't gather to bury their loved ones.
Families were separated. People were making incredible sacrifices.
But not you. Oh no. You partied.
The rest of the country were following the rules.
Your rules.
Doing their bit. Doing their duty.
It wasn't just a case of one rule for us and another for them. It was more like no rules for us.
I want to apologise.
The only thing you're sorry about is you got caught.
I believed implicitly that this was a work event. It could be said technically to fall within the guidance.
A work event? Do you often have work meetings where everyone's told to bring their own booze?
With hindsight, I should have sent everyone back inside.
You broke the law. It's you who should be inside.
I have satisfied myself that the guidelines were followed at all times.
And we're satisfied you knowingly and intentionally flouted the rules because you believe you're above the law. Well, fella, you've got another thing coming, believe you me. Because there are rules. The rules that bind us as a society and as a people.
Fairness.
Decency.
Integrity.
The party's over.
Those were people at work. Those were meetings of people at work talking about...
Mother of God, you must think we were born yesterday, fella.
Your corruption was mistaken for incompetence.
If you have got one shred of compassion for all those families who sacrificed so much, who lost so much, you'll go and let them have done with you.
Everyone thinks they know who Boris Johnson is. But where is he really from? Now, I'm a market researcher by background. We research nerds have a marvellous tool to help us understand groups of people. It's called geodemographics, GDs. The premise of GDs is that you are where you live. Birds of a feather flock together is the thinking. Now, despite the distraction of Mr. Johnson's exotic bloodlines, as revealed in the BBC's Who Do You Think You Are in 2008, Turkish, French, German, Jewish, royal, and his family's Devon farm, his US birthplace, and his cosmopolitan Euro stints, the adult Mr. Johnson is most consistently a Londoner. What kind of London has Johnson been? What do Mr. Johnson's London milieu and his postcode say about him? Now, I know those places and the people who live in them, and I think I know what they mean. Judged by his London postcodes, Boris Johnson is that hate figure of right-wing populist propagandists the world over. He's a member of the metropolitan liberal elite. The people the Mail and the Express really loathe. Just consider for one sparkling moment how many of Johnson's London postcodes have an N in them, as in Primrose Hill NW1 and Islington N1, for instance. Their Daily Mail code for not like us, meaning comfortably off people who have talkative dinner parties and spout what's now called wokeism. And they do virtue signaling, which is the spectator phrase for parading fashionable liberal sentiment, or so the story goes. Now, Mr. Johnson's lived around these people and these places for decades, the places where better paid media types live, people who are that bit socially liberal. Now, these end places are decidedly nice, houses, shops, everything, but they're not where the much richer hypertoffs and plutocrats live. They're absolutely not like Knightsbridge, SW1X, Belgravia, SW1, Mayfair, W1, Heavy Kensington, W8, or Upper Chelsea, SW3. Those are the places where the masters of the universe live. When they're in London, people so rich they can afford to give hundreds of thousands, even millions, to political parties. So despite being an N person with N person money, Mr. Johnson's unusually well connected with people who are vastly grander and richer than him. In part, it's Eton. Most of the N people went to lesser public schools, and partly because he's been a celebrity for more than 2 decades. Toffs and plutocrats like famous faces at their parties, and politicians are useful. If you want to be, as Mr. Johnson put it at the age of 5, world king, you've got to know people who get with your former neighbours in N18AP, the Vapors. And you've got to learn from people like Dominic Cummings, or even from Donald Trump's campaign manager, Steve Bannon, who notably claimed he'd co-written Mr. Johnson's 2018 resignation speech. By the way, Mr. Johnson hates people saying that. In summer 2022, some of those big money people like Lord Cruddas, claimed that there'd been a coup against Boris Johnson. Secretary of State Nadine Dorries said that too. Do they mean illegal, and therefore a reversal could be legitimate? If this stirs worries in N1, then wise heads say it could never happen here. They say that Brits would never rally round a big steel story like the one that most 2020 Trump voters still believe, even after the January 6th riot revelations. Certainly no gent of any kind, no One Nation Tory, and certainly no one who'd ever lived in London N1. Wherever he lived, Boris the brand was recognised by comedians who fine-tuned him even before he became Prime Minister or World King.
Earlier this week, Latin bullshit mountain Boris Johnson took a highly amusing stuff. took the highly unusual step of drawing attention to himself. It was the first of 5 speeches by cabinet ministers aimed at uniting the country behind Brexit. In case you missed it, here it is. Hello everyone, and welcome to my latest selfish and shameless noble and diplomatic attempt to reach out to promote myself. Brexit. Yes, and I will beguile you by shouting words with no context. Carrots. Yes, carrots. Who said carrots? I did. Yes, I want to reach out to these Romaniacs, the quislings, the damp-trousered country-hating Ramona scum. We must all, must we not? We must embrace Brexit. I remember the exact moment that I did. Michael Gove came to my house with some black and white photographs of me and said, vote Leave, or I'll send these to the Sun. And I've been convinced ever since Brexit is whatever we want it to be. It is liberal and internationalist, and UKIP are left-wing, and meat is vegetarian, and I have got a vagina. I will also keep saying carrots. Yes, carrots. Why? Any questions here?
Thank you, Foreign Secretary. Andy Bell, 5 News. Are you still saying we can have our cake and eat it?
What I am saying, Andy Bell, 5 News, is that you can have enough cake to make Marie Antoinette blush. A great superabundance of delectables, yes. And you can have your cake, and you can have your cake, and you can have your cake. Your carrot cake, yes, carrots. And for those of you seeking a sense clarity, let me just spell this out. We must unite and not give in to these ham-headed Hugglepuffs, tism-toed tigglewimps, or indeed wimble-witted weddy-wumps. What could be clearer than that?
So if the people didn't take him seriously as a politician, just how good a comedian is Boris? Oliver Double teaches comedy at the University of Kent. He was a stand-up comedian in a previous life. Oliver, why did Mr. Johnson develop his act?
Well, I mean, I suppose probably if you really want to dig into his origin story, it probably goes back to his time at the Oxford Union. But I think for the point of view of most people, he came to public prominence via Have I Got News for You? And he did a number of appearances on there, initially as a guest and later as a chair. And his first one was 1998. And it's really interesting looking back at it because he did really well with that. I think it sort of built his reputation as being a funny and engaging person. And he even, had sort of BAFTA things from his time doing Have I Got News for You. But the thing is, if you watch his first appearance, he is the guest who is there to have the piss taken from him. And that is how he plays for most of the episode. He gets mild laughter, but the Hislop and Merton particularly get more laughs at his expense. And the moment it really takes off for him, and it's really interesting, by the way, if you go back and watch that footage now, because he doesn't quite look the Boris that we know today. It's a bit like looking at an early sketch of Mickey Mouse. It's familiar, but disturbingly different from what we've come to know. And the thing is, his hair looks quite normal, really, compared with what we've come to know it as. But what happens is the moment it takes off from him comedically is the moment that Hislop takes him to task for the Darius Guppy thing, the telephone conversation we had earlier, where he was entertaining his fraudster chum in his conspiracy to have a journalist beaten up. And Hislop puts it to him that this happened, and Johnson says, yes, that did come up. And there's a huge laugh because he's so sort of, unbothered by it, inappropriately unbothered by such a serious allegation. And people find that very funny. Now, the thing is, there's a theory of stand-up that what stand-ups represent is conduct which would normally be disapproved of. And it's the fact that they're able to make it funny makes us kind of accept those things. And you could argue that it's a way of challenging normal societal expectations. And that's what Johnson's doing, really. I mean, if you're accused of being caught up in a conspiracy to beat somebody up, you're supposed to be concerned and take it seriously. You're not supposed to say, oh, yes, I think we did talk about it. But that's I think, the origin story of Boris, the pseudo-comedian. That's the moment where he becomes funny, and his all the things that could be negatives, his dishonesty, his willingness to get involved in shadiness, all of that stuff becomes a positive because it becomes a source of him being funny and engaging. And then, of course, it becomes a kind of comic carapace. So there are lots of stories about people witnessing him preparing for a public engagement by ruffling the hair. And the hair is part of it. Oh gosh, you know me, I'm a terrible shower. I couldn't possibly have done it knowingly bad. It was a scrape, as if he's just raided the school tuck shop or something. So I think it had two real purposes. One is to make him more likable and engaging. And let's be honest, not all politicians have those qualities. And then secondly, it's a defence against allegations of wrongdoing, which, let's be honest, there are plenty of those when Johnson comes into the picture.
Now, you've studied comedy. How good a comedian is he? Set him against the best.
Well, I don't think he's that great. I've got to be honest. If you think about some of his famous speeches, I mean, there was the Whiff Waff one, where he was building up to the 2012 Olympics, and he was talking about the fact that the British played table tennis and called it Whiff Waff. But if you watch that speech, there's not actually that many laughs. If you go to his final speech as Prime Minister in the Commons, he gets quite a good laugh by saying, when they ask him who he'd like to succeed him, he gets quite a good laugh by saying, I haven't really been following it very closely. And of course that fits with this idea of him being nonchalant and unbothered by things, and that gets a good laugh. But then he tries to pull out the old gag about the kind of pun about wiping the floor with somebody, which was it's a double meaning on white floor. So he says that any one of his successors, and this is a quote, any one of which were, as I say before, like some household detergent, would wipe the floor with, then there's a hubbub, but not a laugh note, a hubbub, with ruh. He can't even get the joke out, and it gets a hubbub of approval, but not actually a laugh. And actually, of course, his most famous speech of recent years is the Peppa Pig speech. And what he seems to be doing there is trying to do the nonchalant thing, but failing. And I think one of the reasons that to be fair, he can be very successful in getting laughs. And there's the famous Jeremy Vine story where Jeremy Vine saw him turn up to a awards ceremony, and he turns up late and is informed that he's going to give a speech, and he pretends like he didn't know he was giving a speech, so he grabs a piece of paper and starts writing things down on it. And then he goes up and he's very shambolic, and all the shambolic behaviour is really funny. And he gets huge laughs, including a story at the end where he forgets the punchline. And that in itself is, of course, the actual punchline. Him forgetting the punchline, he gets a huge laugh for that. And then Vine witnesses him do the exact same trick several months later. So the turning up late, scribbling the paper, exact same material, including the same lost punchline. So that worked. But I think perhaps what Johnson hadn't realised is that behind, however offhand and casual comedians appear, the bit you see on stage is the tip of the iceberg. Actually, they work really hard, and there's a huge amount of work and effort that's gone into that, as well as the kind of learning process that they've gone through to learn to be that good. And I think Johnson's basically allergic to work. So I think he could have probably been a brilliant comedian if he put work into it, but I don't think he did. So I think very, very mixed, let's put it that way.
Great. Now, let's look at how one comedian, Jonathan Pye, received the news of Mr. Johnson's demise back in July.
So he's gone. He's fucked off then. He's resigned. Okay, so he's resigned, but he hasn't fucked off. Okay. What do we have to do? Wait for another few months whilst he takes the wallpaper down? I'm loving this. What an exit. The Prime Minister forgot that his whip was a sexual predator. No answer to that one. No answer, no humility, no meaningful apology. For days, just more Dickensian twaddle and a little reshuffle. Not so much reshuffling deck chairs on the Titanic, more reshuffling cat shit on a litter tray. And the manner of his departure should tell you everything you need to know. No dignity, just desperation and delusion and a despotic disposal to cling to power, no matter the harm to our country. A Tory party facing the inevitable truth that they have been complicit in enabling one of the most dangerously incompetent and untrustworthy, selfish individuals ever to have occupied number 10 for as long as they have. And what's beautiful is it was the lying that got him in the end. He leaves in disgrace, as well he should, having exposed himself once and for all for what we always knew him to be. Not a statesman, but a sad little liar. A Shakespearean tragedy written by monkeys on typewriters. A prime minister who is as adept at lying at the dispatch box as he is to his string of mistresses. Every marriage Boris has had has ended when he fucked someone else and got them pregnant. That's who he is. Lies on top of lies on top of lies. He lies and gets people to lie on his behalf, and then lies about the lying. And when he runs out of lies, he can always rely on the incompetence card. I forgot, I can't remember. I don't understand what the word party means. My willy just ended up inside my secretary. Oh, I forgot that he's a renowned sex pest. Essentially, a man who would rather pretend to be stupid than admit his mistakes, which of course makes him a coward.
Wasn't that wonderful? Did you know it's actually Sir Alan Duncan doing a funny turn? Anyway, on the other side of the Atlantic, there's another cracked political actor, one Donald J. Trump. He thought he'd found a soulmate in the man he actually called Britain Trump. Now they're both out of office. David K. Johnston is Trump's anti-Boswell. He's tracked Trump since Atlantic City in 1988. He's chronicled all of DJT's financial and political shenanigans in fine, granular detail. His latest book is called The Big Cheat. David, what are the similarities between Mr. Trump and Mr. Johnson?
Well, they could be twins fundamentally, Peter. Both of them are clowns. They have no real education, any deep thought. Just as Donald Trump didn't understand why there was a memorial built over the sunk USS Arizona at Pearl Harbor and thought Finland was part of Russia, there are outtakes of Boris Johnson being told by his staff fundamental facts that anyone who graduated from grammar school or certainly high school should know. And both of them are so full of themselves. They are such malignant narcissists that everything around is about them. You, Peter, me in America, we're just instruments or tools, things to be used by both of these men. And they have no regard for anyone but themselves. Their principal success is in figuring out how to get people to support them, even though there is no logic or rational reason to support them, because they're idiots in the classic Greek meaning of that word. They think only of themselves.
How are they different?
Well, Boris Johnson at least can write. He's written a crude book called 72 Virgins, I believe, with his crude descriptions of women. Donald has a lot of books, but he didn't write any of those books. Other people wrote them for him. That's one area. Secondly, Boris Johnson has to some degree, he recognizes the need to win people over with humor. Donald can't take a joke about anything. He's in all the years I've known him, he cannot tell a joke. If the one or two times I've seen him do it, they were forced. And Boris Johnson at least understands that humor is disarming.
Who do you think is the greater threat to democracy?
Oh, I think both of them are, but I think the greater threat is something that's underneath this. How did people like this, who are manifestly unfit to hold any office greater than dog catcher, how did they get where they got? Well, democracy to many people has become a game. They don't pay serious attention to it. We have in both Britain and the United States, these campaign finance rules that make politicians accountable not to the voters, but to their donors. And we've had Russian money influence elections in both countries, and who knows what other secret money influencing elections. So I think both of them are frankly equally dangerous. One thing Boris Johnson has not done is called to violence to keep him in power, which I predicted back in 2015 Donald Trump would do if he got to the White House. He would never leave peacefully, and we've seen that that's the case. Johnson, at least, has not said, get your pitchforks, and they're not available in your country, but AK-47s or AR-15 assault rifles, and go kill police officers. And Trump has effectively said that.
Now, it has to be said that there's somebody called Lord Cruddas who suggested very heavily that Johnson leaving is a coup. And there's our gorgeous pouting Secretary of State for Culture, who's called Nadine Dorries. And she also has suggested it's a coup. So while he may not have said it, a number of his backers have said, and enthusiasts have very, very definitely said it's a coup. So what do we do about that? Both, I would say, are strongly suggesting that they'll come back as king. How do you rate their chances?
Well, Donald Trump's chances in the U.S. are 0 and none, and he's finally slowly losing his grip on people, but much too slowly. And Boris Johnson, I don't know. I'm not deeply enough into British politics to understand what his chances are. But when voters choose to remove you, by definition, that is not a coup. And what it shows is that both Boris Johnson and Donald Trump, who grew up in these very privileged environments with parents who didn't make them learn fundamental lessons about the other, as the psychologists call it, capital T, capital O, the other, and have utter disregard for everyone else, they believe they're entitled to hold their office. Well, that's not democracy. That's not representative democracy as a republic. That's the road to dictatorship. And both in America and in Britain, ordinary voters need, if they want to maintain their liberties, to understand you have to have limits on power and how long power is held. And you have to respect what the majority chooses to do. You have to protect the minority's interests, but you have to go where the majority of people in each election choose.
Thank you very much, David. Now, back to Boris Johnson as just a British politician. As a British politician, he wasn't using sheer brute force like Donald Trump, not storming the home of democracy like the US Capitol, but closing it down, definitely closing it down, as when Mr. Johnson prorogued our UK Parliament in September 2019 to ram through his Brexit deal to get it done, in his words. But one woman stood in his way. Gina Miller. How do you remember it now, Gina?
Gosh, it was a very emotional time because Boris Johnson had a great sway of the media attacking me and saying that I was actually trying to thwart Brexit. So it was a misinformation campaign about why I was bringing the case, and also putting it that it was about Brexit. It wasn't about our constitution. It wasn't about him trying to shut down our democracy and the doors of Parliament. So we live in a representative democracy, and he was putting himself above the law in closing down Parliament in the way he wanted to. And so it was an incredibly emotional time, a very febrile time for me and for my family and for my team, because the media coerced and helped him and his followers helped him to pollute the conversation when the conversation and the case was actually about the separation of power and holding those in power to account.
How do you feel about Mr. Johnson now?
The way I've always felt about Mr. Johnson is that, he has never possessed any of the characteristics that I think suit the office of state in which he's held. And I've always thought that he's a dangerous character because as a narcissist, a malignant narcissist, I would absolutely agree with that. It is not what he does. It is who he is. And he is somebody who's dishonest, and he makes dishonesty appear splendid. And unfortunately, that then destroys our complete political landscape. It damages our institutions. It damages our democracy. It damages trust in our democracy and in Parliament. And it damages the ability for people to hold those in power to account. So he has been a poison to Parliament, to our political system, and to our international reputation.
When it comes down to it, and this sounds like a rather odd, bittersweet question, will you sort of miss him?
Absolutely not. I think there's one thing I would thank him for in an odd way, which is he is an exemplar of something that I've been saying for a very long time, which is that we have a very naive system of checks and balances in our Parliament, what's called the good chap model of government, where we believe that they will just do the right thing. And I think he has exemplified why we need to have the things I've been campaigning for, which is checks and balances put on a legal footing. Because I am not sure that he's gone for good. I think he will try and come back because his life is about power. His life is about wanting to be walking. And I think we need to put in the checks and balances so there isn't somebody like Mr. Johnson or Mr. Johnson himself back in that office and unaccountable.
You think he's going to have another go?
I wouldn't. There are too many rumours in the mill. I don't think he's gone for good.
You wouldn't put it past him, as they say. What about
Absolutely
the nation?
not.
I mean, there's clearly a fan club, a small group of powerful, rather vocal people saying it's a coup and he's been hard done by. And they clearly will miss Mr. Johnson. And they very much hope, so it seems, that Ms. Truss can be regarded as a continuity candidate, a continuity PM. What about the nation, though? How are you reading the feelings of the nation now?
I think the nation is in a terrible place. The idea of decency, compassion, caring for each other, that has all been damaged by our politics and our politicians because they have chosen to pursue, not just Mr. Johnson, but for some years now, the politics of othering. And that does not bode well for our nation. And I think as long as we have politicians who poison the well of our nation and our culture and our values and our conversations and our ability to debate, then I think we're a lesser country and we're in great danger as we face the headwinds that are coming towards us economically, environmentally, socially, because our time and bandwidth is being consumed by these clowns. Basically, they are taking the bandwidth away from the conversations we should be having about where our country goes.
And the othering you talk about, you mean politicians who do culture war stuff, national newspapers who do hatchet jobs with anyone who disagrees with the line to be taken. Do you think you've been othered?
No, absolutely. I mean, yeah. Well, look, today we've got a perfect example that my lawyer, Lord Panic, has come out with an opinion on the Boris Johnson line in Parliament, and he has said that he believes that the Select Committee is wrong. And all of a sudden, you've got everybody up in arms. You cannot cherry pick when it comes to the law. And they repositioned and basically propagandized why it is I took my 2 cases. And you cannot have that in a stable democracy. You cannot cherry pick the decisions that you believe are right or wrong. You cannot make everything about petty politics. The separation of powers is absolutely fundamental to the stability of our country.
That's a very severe warning for us all. Thank you very much. Now, so there we have it. Boris Johnson, media creation, media clown, media casualty. Buy the book on Amazon. By September the 5th, Britain will have it. Britain will have had it, rather. One of the shortest serving, and some people say, the worst PMs in history. One who set out to be the new Churchill, but ended up as a sort of a national joke. Who was the joke on? Quoting Peppa Pig to a bemused group of business leaders at the CBI. As Richard Littlejohn used to say, you couldn't make it up. But Boris Johnson did.
Yesterday I went, as we all must, to Peppa Pig World. I don't know if you've been to Peppa Pig World. Who's been to? Hands up anyone who's been to Peppa Pig World. Not enough. I was a bit hazy what I would find at Peppa Pig World, but I loved it. And Peppa Pig World is very much my kind of place. But the real lesson for me going to Peppa Pig World, and I'm surprised you haven't been there, was about the power of UK creativity. Who would have believed, Tony, that a pig that looks like a hairdryer, or possibly a sort of Picasso-like hairdryer, a pig that was rejected by the BBC, would now be exported to 180 countries with theme parks both in America and in China, as well as in the New Forest. And so with safer streets, with great local schools, with fantastic broadband, forgive me. Forgive me. Forgive me.